Dr. Malcolm Grant, a highly respected black surgeon, finds his life upended after a routine traffic stop turns into an infuriating encounter of racial profiling. Treated as a suspect instead of a citizen, Malcolm becomes the target of systemic racism ingrained in law enforcement and beyond. As the incident spirals, Malcolm uncovers shocking evidence of institutionalized prejudice, revealing how deeply biased policies perpetuate harm against marginalized communities. His fight for justice places him at odds with powerful figures intent on silencing him, forcing him to confront the painful reality of racism in America and the cost of speaking out. As the storm lashed against the fragile walls of the lighthouse, casting eerie shadows across the stone floors, Eliza's hands trembled with the weight of her decision. Outside, waves clawed at the cliffs, their thunderous crashes a violent reminder of the tempest she had faced not only tonight, but throughout her life. The lighthouse had stood as a beacon for centuries, a symbol of hope and guidance. Now, it was more than that. It was a lifeline. And Eliza, the sole keeper of its flame after her father's untimely death, had become its reluctant guardian. For most of her 26 years, Eliza had fought against her ties to this place. She wanted to see the world, to leave the island behind, and forge her own path. But fate had other plans. When her father fell ill, she returned home, promising herself it was only temporary. Yet here she was, 2 years later, with no clear path forward. Tonight, the storm threatened not just the structure of the lighthouse, but her own sense of identity. Could she stand firm, or would the storm tear down the fragile resolve she clung to? From the window, Eliza glimpsed the distant outline of a ship struggling against the waves. Her heart raced. The light above her swirled in rhythmic sweeps, piercing through the darkness and warning the vessel of the jagged rocks below. She prayed silently, willing the beam to reach its mark. Behind her, a sharp knock echoed from the heavy wooden door, startling her from her thoughts. She hesitated. Visitors were rare, especially on a night like this. Drawing a deep breath, Eliza tightened her grip on the lantern she carried and moved toward the sound, the flame within flickering with her uncertainty. When she opened the door, a man stood there, drenched and shivering, his expression a mixture of desperation and determination. His voice was strained as he spoke, barely audible over the storm's howl. "I need your help. The ship. It's my family." Eliza's pulse quickened. The weight of the storm bore down on her shoulders, but this stranger's plea was heavier. As she stepped aside to let him in, the decision loomed before her. Would she risk everything to save lives, or would she remain safely behind the walls of the lighthouse, bound by fear and doubt? The light above continued its steady dance, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a single beam could make all the difference. Would you like me to continue expanding on this story? 2-2. Banja Noi. Now that you have thoroughly analyzed the sample story and understood its style, structure and tone, begin writing the opening section of the new story. This section should span approximately 1,500 words. Focus areas for this section. Introduce the protagonist. Create a black character who is wealthy and powerful, e.g., a CEO, judge, surgeon, or activist. Highlight their humility and modest lifestyle, showing how it contrasts with their societal position. Set the scene. Establish the setting and provide context about the social climate, hinting at systemic challenges and prejudices the protagonist might face. Create the initial situation. Place the protagonist in a setting where their authority or identity might be overlooked, e.g., is a casual diner, a luxury shop, or a small-town courthouse. Use subtle actions or dialogue to suggest the brewing conflict. Tone and style. Maintain an engaging conversational tone. Use vivid descriptions to bring the setting and characters to life while hinting at the tensions to come. Instructions. Write this section to lay the foundation for the story, ensuring the protagonist is relatable and the scene is immersive. When finished, confirm readiness to proceed to prompt 3 for developing the initial conflict. ChatGPT Banja Noi, ChatGPT title, The Measure of Power. The warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the modest diner as the early morning sunlight streamed through its smudged windows. Against the backdrop of clinking cutlery and murmured conversations, Dr. Malcolm Grant sat at his usual booth by the window. his tailored navy blue suit, subtly marked by the craftsmanship of a designer most wouldn't recognize, fit him perfectly. But to the regulars here, Malcolm wasn't a titan of cardiac surgery. He was just the man who always left a generous tip and treated the staff with uncommon courtesy. He liked it that way. Malcolm had built his empire in silence. At 48, he was the chief of cardiac surgery at one of the country's most prestigious hospitals, a celebrated author of pioneering research, and the owner of a multi-million-dollar healthcare consultancy. Yet here he sat, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug in a diner on the corner of Maple and Fifth, the same one he'd frequented for years, even before he could afford the top-shelf whiskey now tucked into his office cabinet. The diner, Betty's Place, was as unassuming as its clientele. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and a faded poster advertising a pie-eating contest from 1997 clung stubbornly to the back wall. Malcolm appreciated the diner's simplicity, a retreat from the marble-floored boardrooms and the suffocating adulation of colleagues eager to impress. As he thumbed through the day's headlines on his phone, his attention wavered to the table across the aisle. A young couple sat there, their conversation hushed but animated. Malcolm smiled faintly, recognizing the passion of youth, where every moment felt charged with purpose. He'd been like that once, fighting uphill battles, not just in the operating room, but against a world that didn't expect him to succeed. A black man commanding surgical teams, shaping policy, and defying stereotypes wasn't just rare, it was revolutionary. Betty, the diner's owner and namesake, shuffled over with her practiced warmth, her apron smudged, but her smile genuine. "Morning, Malcolm. Your usual?" He nodded. "Can't stray too far from tradition, can I?" She chuckled, topping off his coffee. "If you ever do, I'll probably fall over." "You want the paper?" Han left it at the counter. "Thanks, Betty, but I've got everything I need right here," he said, holding up his phone. He liked Betty too. She treated everyone the same, like family, but with an edge sharp enough to cut through nonsense when it surfaced. As Malcolm settled into his routine, the diner's door jingled. A man in his late 30s stepped inside, his pinstripe suit and slicked-back hair radiating ambition. He moved with the assured air of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The man surveyed the room briefly, before walking up to the counter, where Betty greeted him with her usual cheer. "How can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for Dr. Grant," the man said, his voice clipped. "We're supposed to meet here." Malcolm's ears perked up. He folded his hands over the table and watched, amused, as the man scanned the room, eyes darting past Malcolm's booth without a second glance. "I'm Dr. Grant," Malcolm called, raising his hand. The man turned, blinking in surprise. His eyes briefly flicked to Malcolm's suit, but lingered longer than necessary on his dark skin. A split second of hesitation passed before he approached, his face smoothing into what Malcolm recognized as a rehearsed smile. "Oh, I was expecting someone different." The man caught himself, but the words hung awkwardly in the air. "Someone different?" Malcolm repeated, his tone even, though the corners of his mouth twitched with faint amusement. "I mean, more formal, maybe?" the man fumbled, gesturing vaguely. "No offense, of course." "None taken." Malcolm gestured to the seat opposite him. "Have a seat." The man slid into the booth, pulling a slim leather briefcase onto the table. "I'm Ryan Cooper, from Riverstone Pharmaceuticals. Thanks for agreeing to meet me." Malcolm inclined his head. "Of course, your email sounded urgent." Ryan chuckled nervously. "It's not every day we get a chance to work with someone of your caliber." He hesitated, glancing around the diner. "Though I must admit, I wasn't expecting this location." Malcolm leaned back, resting his hands on the edge of the table. "And I find places like this tend to put people at ease. No pretenses, no distractions, just good coffee and honest conversation." Ryan nodded, though his expression betrayed his unease. "Right. Well, let me get straight to it. Then Riverstone has been following your work closely, particularly your research on early-stage detection of cardiac irregularities. We believe there's a lucrative opportunity to expand your findings into a new line of diagnostic devices." Malcolm listened intently, his face impassive. He'd heard this pitch, or variations of it, countless times before. But what piqued his interest wasn't the offer itself. It was Ryan's body language. The man's polished confidence cracked at the edges, betraying discomfort that had little to do with business. "Interesting," Malcolm said finally. "But before we dive into specifics, I have a question for you." Ryan stiffened slightly. "Of course." "If I didn't stand up when you walked in," Malcolm said, his voice calm but pointed, "would you have known I was Dr. Grant?" The question hung in the air like smoke, dense and inescapable. Ryan's eyes widened, and he opened his mouth, but no words came out. Malcolm didn't need an answer. The hesitation was enough. "I'm not asking to embarrass you," Malcolm continued, "but it's important to recognize how assumptions shape interactions, especially in spaces where power and perception collide." Ryan swallowed, visibly flustered. I apologize if I came across as—" "Don't apologize," Malcolm interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "Understand? That's what matters." Ryan nodded slowly, his discomfort giving way to something resembling introspection. "You're right, I should have been more mindful." The conversation shifted after that, flowing with less pretense and more honesty. Malcolm listened as Ryan outlined Riverstone's proposal, but his thoughts drifted intermittently. He was no stranger to these moments, subtle reminders that even in rooms where he wielded power, his identity sometimes rendered him invisible or underestimated. By the time their meeting concluded, the diner had begun to fill with its usual morning crowd. Malcolm shook Ryan's hand, his grip firm but warm. "Thank you for taking the time," Ryan said, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect now. "Likewise," Malcolm replied. "Betty will validate your parking on the way out." As Ryan departed, Malcolm leaned back in his seat, letting out a quiet breath. The meeting had gone well enough, but it left a familiar ache, one he'd learned to compartmentalize over the years. Power, after all, didn't insulate him from prejudice. It only reframed the battleground. Betty returned with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, setting it down in front of him with a knowing look. "Trouble?" Malcolm smiled faintly. "Nothing I can't handle." "You always say that," she said, shaking her head as she walked away. Malcolm stared out the window, his gaze distant. In the bustling streets beyond, he saw the reflection of a world still grappling with its own assumptions. He'd spent his life proving he belonged, not for his sake, but for the ones who'd follow. And as he picked up his fork, the weight of that purpose sat heavy, but not unwelcome, on his shoulders. As Malcolm exited the diner, the brisk morning air stung his face. He pulled his coat tighter, the cold seeping through despite the sun's valiant efforts to warm the city. The meeting with Ryan Cooper lingered in his mind. It wasn't the pitch itself. He had heard countless similar proposals over the years, but the moment Ryan's eyes had passed over him, failing to connect his presence with the title of Dr. Grant. It wasn't new. That was the worst part. As Malcolm approached his parked car, he spotted a small group of people gathered on the sidewalk across the street. A police cruiser idled nearby, its blue lights flashing softly, adding an uneasy tension to the scene. A uniformed officer, tall and broad-shouldered, stood near the group, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his shoulder. Malcolm's instincts bristled, though he told himself not to jump to conclusions. Still, he couldn't ignore how the officer's body language shifted as Malcolm unlocked his car. The faint beep of the lock seemed to catch the officer's attention. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Enough for Malcolm to see the suspicion in the man's gaze. "Hey, sir!" the officer called out, his tone sharp. Malcolm froze, his hand on the car door. He turned slowly, deliberately. The group on the sidewalk quieted, their attention now divided between the officer and Malcolm. "Yes?" Malcolm replied, his voice measured. "You parked here?" the officer asked, gesturing toward Malcolm's sleek black car. "Yes," Malcolm said. "Why?" The officer's eyes narrowed. "Got ID on you?" Malcolm's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" The man's hand shifted to his belt, resting on the taser holstered there. "Just doing my job. You fit the description of someone we're looking for." A ripple of frustration spread through Malcolm's chest. He knew the script too well. The so-called description was vague, meant to justify the intrusion rather than explain it. Still, he reached for his wallet, keeping his movements deliberate. As he handed over his driver's license, he asked, "What's the description?" The officer glanced at the ID, then at Malcolm. Black male, mid-40s, wearing a suit driving a black vehicle. "That's not a description," Malcolm said, the words slipping out before he could stop himself. That's an archetype. The officer's gaze darkened. Watch your tone. Malcolm bit the inside of his cheek. He wanted to argue, to call out the absurdity of the situation, but he could feel the weight of the officer's authority pressing against him like a hand on his chest. He could also feel the eyes of the crowd on him, some curious, some wary. The officer handed back the ID, his expression unreadable. Mind telling me why you're here? I had a meeting at the diner, Malcolm said evenly. I'm a Dr. A surgeon. The officer's mouth twitched, as though suppressing a smirk. That's so. Yes, Malcolm said, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. Do you need proof of that as well? Before the officer could respond, a second cruiser pulled up. Another officer, a younger man with an air of overzealous eagerness, stepped out. The first officer waved him over. What's going on here? The younger man asked, his eyes flicking between Malcolm and the scene across the street. Routine check, the first officer said. This guy's claiming he's a doctor. Malcolm felt his jaw tighten. Not claiming I am. The younger officer raised an eyebrow. Mind if we check the car? You know, just to be thorough. That was it. Malcolm's patience snapped, though he fought to keep his tone level. Thorough for what I've done, nothing wrong. You've seen my ID. You have no probable cause. The first officer's expression hardened. You're awfully defensive for someone with nothing to hide. Malcolm opened his mouth to respond, but the group across the street erupted in chatter. A woman pointed toward the police cruiser, calling out, What about us? We're the ones who called for help. The officers turned, momentarily distracted. Malcolm followed their gaze, piecing together what must have happened. The woman's frantic gestures and the overturned shopping cart on the sidewalk suggested some kind of petty theft or altercation. Yet here he was, treated as a suspect for merely existing in proximity to the scene. The first officer's attention snapped back to Malcolm. Stay here, he said, his tone clipped. We'll sort this out. Malcolm's stomach churned. He could feel the simmering anger rising in his chest, threatening to boil over. He clenched his fists at his sides, willing himself to stay calm. The scene was absurd, unjust, yet he knew any display of anger would only escalate the situation. He had seen it happen too many times, to friends, colleagues, strangers on the news. Minutes stretched into an eternity as the officers conferred near the patrol cars, occasionally glancing at Malcolm. He caught snippets of their conversation, phrases like, he's clean, and nothing suspicious, but the humiliation lingered. Finally, the first officer approached. You're free to go, he said, his tone begrudging. Malcolm inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Am I getting an apology? The officer scoffed. For what, doing my job? Malcolm held his gaze for a long moment before stepping into his car. As he pulled away, he caught a glimpse of the group on the sidewalk watching him, their faces a mixture of sympathy and unease. The humiliation stayed with him as he drove back to the hospital. It wasn't just the incident itself, but what it represented. A stark reminder of how quickly his accomplishments, his title, even his humanity, could be dismissed. At the hospital, the day continued with its usual rhythm: morning rounds, consultations, and a complex surgery scheduled for the afternoon. But Malcolm couldn't shake the morning's events. They lingered like a shadow, casting doubt over the sense of control he usually exuded. During his lunch break, he sat in his office, scrolling through emails, when a knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Dr. Priya Rao, a colleague, and one of the few people at the hospital who felt like an ally. You okay? She asked, leaning against the doorframe. Malcolm hesitated. Priya had a way of reading him that made hiding the truth feel futile. He gestured for her to sit, and as she did, he recounted the morning's encounter with the police. Priya listened intently, her expression shifting between anger and sadness. God, Malcolm, I'm so sorry. That's awful. He shrugged, though his chest felt tight. It's not new. It doesn't make it right, Priya said, her voice firm. You shouldn't have to deal with that, not after everything you've accomplished. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Sometimes I wonder if it even matters. The degrees, the awards, the title. It doesn't protect me. I'm just another black man to them. Priya's eyes softened. You're so much more than that, Malcolm. Don't let their ignorance diminish you. He nodded, but her words didn't fully penetrate the haze of frustration. He knew she meant well, but the weight of systemic bias was heavy, relentless. It wasn't just this morning. It was a lifetime of moments like these, chipping away at the armor he'd built. As Priya left, Malcolm turned back to his desk. The afternoon surgery loomed, and he needed to focus. But a part of him couldn't help but think about what he would do next. How he could confront not just the individuals, but the system that allowed such prejudice to flourish. Malcolm's fingers tightened around the surgical scalpel as he guided it with precision. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors, a steady background to his thoughts. The surgery, a triple bypass, demanded his full focus, but his mind was restless. The morning's encounter with the police lingered like a shadow, fueling a quiet anger he couldn't suppress. It wasn't the first time he had been profiled, but it had left him raw, the humiliation unshakable. "Dr. Grant?" A nurse's voice broke through his concentration. "Yes," Malcolm said, his tone calm despite the turmoil inside. "Vitals are steady, you're clear for the next step." He nodded, resuming the procedure with steady hands. By the time the operation was over, Malcolm felt the familiar sense of pride in a job well done, though it was dulled by the events of the day. As he stripped off his gloves and exited the operating room, his phone buzzed in the pocket of his scrubs. A text from Priya flashed on the screen. "We need to talk. Come to the admin office ASAP." Malcolm's stomach tightened. Priya wasn't prone to dramatics, so her urgency unsettled him. He quickly changed into fresh scrubs and made his way to the administrative wing. The tension in the corridors seemed thicker than usual, the staff exchanging hushed whispers as he passed. When he entered the office, Priya was waiting, her arms crossed and her expression grim. Beside her stood Mitchell, the hospital's chief legal officer, a man whose presence rarely boded well. "What's going on?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady but wary. Priya exchanged a glance with Mitchell before speaking. "There's been an incident, and it involves you." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Go on?" Mitchell cleared his throat. "This morning, a video surfaced online showing your interaction with the police outside the diner." Malcolm froze. "What?" Priya stepped closer, lowering her voice as if trying to soften the blow. "Someone filmed the entire thing. It's gone viral and not in a good way." Mitchell turned his laptop around, pressing play on the video. Malcolm's heart sank as he watched the scene unfold from a shaky phone camera perspective. The clip showed him standing by his car, the officers questioning him while the crowd murmured in the background. The commentary from the person filming was damning. "This is Dr. Malcolm Grant. They're harassing him because he's black and successful." The video cut off before the situation de-escalated, leaving the viewer with the impression that Malcolm had been targeted, humiliated, and profiled. Which was true, but it wasn't the whole story. Worse, the video had been edited to emphasize the officer's aggression and Malcolm's restraint, painting a picture that the media was already running with. "Local news picked it up an hour ago," Mitchell said, his tone clipped. "They're framing it as another example of systemic bias in policing. And now, certain people are asking questions about your background." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" Mitchell sighed. "The hospital board is concerned. They're worried about the optics." Priya cut in, her voice sharp. "Concerned about optics? Malcolm didn't do anything wrong." "That's not the point," Mitchell said, running a hand through his graying hair. "This is a PR nightmare. The hospital is being dragged into it because of your public profile. Sponsors, donors, they're all watching." "So, what are you suggesting?" Malcolm asked, his voice low but firm. Mitchell hesitated. "The board wants to issue a statement. Something neutral, distancing the hospital from the situation." Malcolm felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. "Distancing themselves from me, you mean?" "It's not personal, Malcolm," Mitchell said, though his tone betrayed discomfort. "It's damage control." Priya bristled. "He's the victim here. The only damage is from a system that treats a respected surgeon like a criminal." Mitchell raised his hands defensively. "I don't make the decisions, I just deliver the message." Malcolm stood, the anger simmering beneath his calm facade. "No, if they want to release a statement, it won't be at my expense, I won't let them." Mitchell sighed. "I'll take that back to the board. But Malcolm, Think carefully, this could escalate further. Later that evening, Malcolm sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the city lights. The day had unraveled faster than he could process. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some from colleagues offering support, others from journalists seeking comment. He ignored them all. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Priya, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She set one on his desk and sat across from him. "You okay?" she asked softly. "No," he admitted. "But I will be." Priya studied him for a moment. "What are you going to do?" Malcolm exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I don't know. The hospital wants me to stay silent, but that feels like conceding." "You don't have to stay silent," Priya said firmly. "You have a platform, use it." He gave her a wry smile. "And risk losing everything I've worked for?" "Malcolm," she said, leaning forward, "you've spent your entire career breaking barriers. This is just another one. If you back down now, what message does that send, not just to the hospital, but to the people who look up to you?" Her words struck a chord, but the weight of the decision loomed large. Speaking out meant risking his position, his reputation, and potentially his career. But staying silent felt like a betrayal. To himself, to those who had fought similar battles, and to the truth. The following morning, Malcolm walked into the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. The whispers and sideways glances from staff were more pronounced now, but he ignored them. He had made his decision. By noon, he had drafted a statement. It was concise, but powerful, addressing the incident and the larger issues it represented. He sent it to the hospital board, with a note. "This is what I'll be sharing publicly. Do with it what you will." The response was immediate. Mitchell called him into a meeting with the board, their expressions ranging from anxious to outright hostile. "This is reckless, Malcolm," one board member said, shaking his head. "You're putting the hospital in a difficult position." "No," Malcolm said firmly. "The system that allows racial profiling to thrive is what puts us in a difficult position. I won't pretend this didn't happen." A tense silence filled the room. Finally, the chairwoman spoke. "Dr. Grant, if you proceed with this, you need to understand the risks your career, your standing. It could all be jeopardized." Malcolm met her gaze. "If I don't speak out, what's the point of any of it? My degrees, my awards, they mean nothing if I can't stand for what's right." The chairwoman sighed but nodded. "Do what you must, but don't expect the hospital to shield you." As Malcolm left the meeting, his resolve hardened. He knew the risks, but he also knew the truth. That night, he posted his statement online, detailing the encounter with the police and the broader implications of systemic bias. The response was overwhelming. Support flooded in from colleagues, patients, and strangers who shared their own stories of injustice. But there were also detractors. Anonymous emails, threats, and accusations began pouring in, accusing him of playing the race card or seeking attention. The pressure mounted, but Malcolm stood firm. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at the hospital to find a protest forming outside. Dozens of people held signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Dr. Grant" and "End Racial Profiling." The sight filled him with both hope and apprehension. Inside, Priya met him at the entrance. "You've started something, Malcolm," she said, her eyes shining with pride. He nodded, his chest swelling with a mixture of determination and trepidation. "Let's see where it goes." As he walked through the corridors, the tension was palpable. Some colleagues avoided his gaze, while others offered quiet nods of support. The hospital's leadership remained conspicuously silent, but Malcolm knew the real battle was just beginning. The protest outside the hospital grew larger with each passing hour, spilling onto the streets as voices clamored for justice. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Journalists hustled with microphones, eager to catch the latest soundbite. Malcolm watched the scene from his office window, his heart a tangle of emotions. He felt a surge of gratitude for the support, but it was undercut by the looming consequences. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Priya stepped in, her face tight with concern. "They're calling an emergency board meeting," she said. "I think it's about you." Malcolm sighed, nodding. "Of course they are." "Mitchell's on your side for what it's worth," she added, sitting across from him. But some of the others, they're not happy. They want a scapegoat, Malcolm said bitterly. And I'm the most convenient target. Priya frowned. It's more than that, you've challenged the status quo that makes people uncomfortable. The tension in the room was palpable as Malcolm leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. I'm not backing down, Priya. They can't silence me. I know, she said softly. But they might try to make an example out of you. When Malcolm entered the boardroom later that afternoon, the atmosphere was icy. The long, polished table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the board members sat stiffly in their chairs, their expressions a mix of discomfort and frustration. At the head of the table sat Chairwoman Evelyn Carter, her steely gaze fixed on him. Dr. Grant, she began, her voice measured. Thank you for joining us on such short notice. Malcolm nodded but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. We've reviewed your public statement, she said, her fingers steepled. While we understand your personal experiences are valid, the manner in which you've chosen to address them has placed the hospital in a precarious position. In what way? Malcolm asked, his tone calm but firm. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. The media attention has been overwhelming. Donors are expressing concern about being associated with a controversial figure. We've also received several complaints from staff who feel the protest is disrupting their ability to provide care. Malcolm felt a flicker of anger, but kept his composure. With all due respect, this isn't about disruption, this is about accountability. If the hospital's reputation is at risk, it's because we're avoiding the hard truths. Evelyn's gaze hardened. The hospital's priority is patient care, not political activism. This isn't political, Malcolm shot back. This is about equity and justice. If we can't stand for that, what does our mission even mean? A murmur rippled through the room. Mitchell cleared his throat, his expression strained. Perhaps we can find a middle ground, he offered. A way to address Dr. Grant's concerns without alienating our stakeholders. Evelyn glanced at him sharply. And what do you suggest? Perhaps a moderated discussion or panel, Mitchell said, his tone cautious. Something that frames this as a learning opportunity rather than a divisive issue. Malcolm shook his head. That's not enough. This isn't about educating a handful of people, this is about systemic change. The room fell silent. Evelyn's expression darkened as she leaned forward. Dr. Grant, you need to understand the gravity of this situation. If you continue down this path, it could result in disciplinary action. Malcolm met her gaze, unflinching. If that's what it takes to stand for what's right, so be it. The tension in the room was suffocating. Evelyn sat back, her face impassive. We'll deliberate and inform you of our decision. Malcolm rose, his resolve unwavering. You know where to find me. As he left the boardroom, Malcolm's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Meet me outside in 10 minutes. It's important. He frowned but decided to follow the lead. Outside, the crowd of protesters had grown even larger, their chants echoing through the streets. He scanned the faces until he spotted a familiar one. Officer Daniels, the cop who had profiled him at the diner. Daniels stood by the edge of the protest, his uniform conspicuous amid the sea of civilians. His posture was tense, and his eyes darted nervously. Malcolm approached cautiously. You asked to meet? Malcolm said, keeping his tone neutral. Daniels nodded, his jaw tight. Yeah, I wanted to talk. Malcolm crossed his arms. About what? Daniels glanced around before speaking, his voice low. I saw the video. And I've been thinking, maybe I overstepped. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Maybe? Daniels winced. Look, I'm not here to make excuses, but you have to understand. It's how we're trained. We're taught to see certain things as threats. Certain things? Malcolm repeated, his voice sharp. Or certain people? Daniels looked away, shame flickering across his face. I'm not proud of it, okay? But the system, it's broken, and people like me, we're part of the problem. Malcolm's anger flared, but he held it in check. Why are you telling me this? Because... Daniels hesitated. Because I want to help. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. The sincerity in Daniels' voice caught Malcolm off guard. He studied the officer, searching for any sign of deceit, but found none. Still, trust didn't come easily. "If you're serious about change," Malcolm said, "you need to start by holding yourself accountable. A public apology would be a good place to start." Daniel swallowed hard. "That's not easy." "Neither is being profiled for existing," Malcolm said coldly. "The choice is yours." Daniels nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." That evening, Malcolm returned to his office to find Priya waiting. She held up a tablet, the screen displaying a news headline. "Hospital board considers action against activist surgeon." "They leaked it," she said grimly. "They're trying to discredit you." Malcolm exhaled sharply, his frustration boiling over. "Let them. I'm done playing their game." Priya placed a hand on his shoulder. "What's the plan?" Malcolm's gaze hardened. "We go public, all of it. The profiling, the systemic bias, the board's cowardice. They want to make an example of me. Fine. Let's show the world what that example really looks like." As Priya nodded, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was Mitchell, his expression conflicted. "I just got out of a call with the chairwoman," he said. "They're preparing to suspend you pending an investigation." Malcolm smiled grimly. "Perfect. Let them. I'm ready." The stage was set. The board's threat loomed, but Malcolm's resolve had never been stronger. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or underestimated. And he wasn't going down without a fight. The protest outside the hospital swelled, the chants rising like a storm surge. Signs bobbed in the air, their messages stark against the dusk sky. "Justice for Dr. Grant. End systemic bias. Stand with Malcolm." The energy was electric, charged by the growing crowd and the tension brewing inside the hospital. Inside, Malcolm stood in the auditorium, facing a packed room of reporters, hospital staff, and community members. The hospital board had hastily convened the town hall, hoping to stem the tide of criticism. Evelyn Carter sat at the head of the panel, flanked by other board members, their expressions taut with anxiety. Mitchell was seated to her left, his face a careful mask of neutrality. Malcolm adjusted the microphone on the podium. His statement had been carefully prepared, but the weight of the moment demanded something rawer. His eyes swept the room, locking briefly on Priya in the front row. She nodded, a silent vote of confidence. He began. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice firm but steady. "This is about a system that dehumanizes, that diminishes, that dismisses the worth of individuals based on their appearance, their background, their existence." A ripple of applause moved through the room, quickly hushed by the board's disapproving glares. Evelyn leaned into her microphone. "Dr. Grant, while we acknowledge your experiences, we must ensure this forum remains productive." "Productive?" Malcolm turned to her, his tone sharp. "Silence is not productive. Sweeping bias under the rug isn't productive. The hospital's refusal to take a stand. That isn't productive." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The room was silent, every eye on Malcolm. "I've spent my entire career proving my worth," he continued. "Not just as a surgeon, but as a person. But when I was stopped by the police outside that diner, none of that mattered. My degrees, my accolades, my humanity. It was all erased in an instant because of the color of my skin." A murmur spread through the crowd. Malcolm leaned forward, gripping the edges of the podium. "The real issue here isn't the officers who stopped me," he said. "It's the system that trained them to see me as a threat. It's the institutions that allow this bias to persist. Institutions like this hospital, where silence is valued over accountability." The murmurs grew louder, punctuated by scattered applause. Evelyn's expression darkened. "Dr. Grant," she interrupted, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is not the appropriate venue for such accusations." Malcolm turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "Then what is, Chairwoman Carter? When is it ever the right time to address injustice?" Evelyn's retort was cut off by a commotion at the back of the room. The doors burst open, and Officer Daniels strode in, his uniform disheveled and his face pale. The room fell silent as he marched to the front, stopping just short of the podium. "Dr. Grant," Daniels said, his voice shaky but loud enough to carry. I need to speak. Malcolm stared at him, the room holding its collective breath. I owe you an apology, Daniel said, his hands trembling at his sides. I profiled you. I stopped you because I assumed. Because the system trained me to assume, and I was wrong. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Daniels glanced at the audience, then back at Malcolm. I've been part of the problem, he admitted, his voice cracking. But I don't want to be anymore. The room erupted in murmurs. Evelyn stood, her face a mask of anger and disbelief. Officer Daniels, she said sharply, this is highly inappropriate. No, Daniels interrupted, his voice rising. What's inappropriate is pretending this doesn't happen. What's inappropriate is punishing Dr. Grant for speaking the truth. Malcolm watched the exchange, his emotions a storm of vindication and disbelief. He stepped back from the podium, letting Daniels's words sink in. Evelyn's composure broke. This is absurd, officer. You are out of line. No, you're out of line, Daniels snapped. You're trying to protect an image instead of addressing the reality, and that's why things never change. The tension in the room reached a fever pitch. Evelyn's face flushed as she struggled for control. Malcolm stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. Enough, he said. The room fell silent. This isn't about finger-pointing, this is about accountability. If we don't address these issues head-on, we're complicit in their perpetuation. Daniels nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. You're right, he said quietly. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Malcolm turned back to the crowd. This is what change looks like. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, and it's long overdue. After the town hall, Malcolm sat in his office, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The fallout from the confrontation would be swift, but he felt a profound sense of clarity. He was done playing it safe. A knock at the door drew his attention. It was Mitchell, his face drawn but thoughtful. You stirred up quite the storm, Mitchell said, stepping inside. Wasn't that the point? Malcolm replied, leaning back in his chair. Mitchell hesitated. The board's not happy. Evelyn's already talking about moving to terminate your contract. Malcolm nodded, unsurprised. Let them, I'll fight it. Mitchell studied him for a moment. You know, you could have played this differently. Kept your head down, made your point quietly. And what would that have accomplished? Malcolm asked. More silence? More complicity? Mitchell sighed. You're right, but don't expect them to go down without a fight. I wouldn't have it any other way, Malcolm said, his resolve unshaken. As Mitchell left, Malcolm turned back to his desk. His phone buzzed with a message from Priya. Proud of you, let's talk strategy tomorrow. He smiled, a flicker of hope breaking through the storm. The stage was set for the final battle. The board's retaliation loomed, but Malcolm was ready. For the first time in years, he felt the full weight of his purpose, and he wasn't backing down. The city council chamber was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. News of Malcolm's public statement and the viral protest outside the hospital had pushed the council to call a special hearing. The purpose was clear: address the growing unrest, though Malcolm suspected it was more about containing the optics than seeking real solutions. The council members sat in a curved row of elevated desks, their expressions a mix of disinterest and thinly veiled irritation. At the center of the room stood Officer Daniels, flanked by his police union representative. His uniform was pristine, but his face betrayed the turmoil beneath the surface. Malcolm, seated across from him, watched as the council chairman called the session to order, his gavel cracking against the wood. This hearing will address the allegations of misconduct and systemic bias raised against the police department, the chairman announced. Dr. Grant, Officer Daniels, you both have the floor to present your accounts. Malcolm rose first, his presence commanding. He walked to the podium, his mind racing but his demeanor calm. He glanced at the audience, filled with journalists, activists, hospital colleagues, and community members. Priya sat near the front, her encouraging nod grounding him. He spoke with precision. I'm here today, not just as a doctor, but as a citizen who has experienced the failures of a system that should protect all of us equally. My encounter with Officer Daniels was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. We must address not just individual actions, but the structures that enable them. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. This is not about vilifying individuals, it's about accountability and reform. We cannot keep excusing behavior that dehumanizes and endangers our communities." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Malcolm locked eyes with Daniels, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The chairman gestured for Daniels to respond. Daniels stood, his movements stiff, and approached the podium. He hesitated before speaking, his voice quieter than expected. "I've been a police officer for over a decade. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. What happened with Dr. Grant was a mistake. I acted on assumptions instead of facts, and for that, I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air, but it felt thin. Malcolm watched Daniels closely, sensing there was more beneath the surface. "But," Daniels continued, his voice growing stronger, "this job isn't easy. We're trained to make split-second decisions, and sometimes those decisions are flawed. It doesn't mean we're bad people, it means we're human." The words struck a nerve in the audience, splitting it between murmured sympathy and skepticism. Malcolm felt a wave of frustration rising. He had heard this refrain too many times, a justification of systemic flaws disguised as vulnerability. As Daniels returned to his seat, Malcolm stood again. "Human error cannot excuse systemic harm," he said firmly. "Officer Daniels, do you truly believe this was an isolated incident? Or is it possible that your actions reflect the biases ingrained in the very system you serve?" Daniels stiffened, his jaw tightening. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying," Malcolm replied. "I'm stating the system you defend allows people like me to be seen as threats before we're seen as human, and until we address that, your apologies mean nothing." The room was electric now, the tension palpable. Before Daniels could respond, Malcolm turned to the council. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been judged, mistreated, or harmed because of systemic bias. Change starts with acknowledgement, but it must end with action." A slow, deliberate clap broke the silence. All eyes turned to a man in the back of the room, a reporter who rose from his seat, his notepad in hand. "Dr. Grant, do you believe Officer Daniels acted alone, or are you suggesting deeper corruption within the department?" The question hung in the air, and Malcolm took a breath. "I believe the issue is systemic, and if we want to move forward, we need transparency. That means looking not just at individual actions, but at the policies and practices that enable them." Daniels's face darkened. "You're making this personal." "It is personal," Malcolm shot back. "But it's also bigger than you or me. This is about the lives affected by a broken system." The hearing recessed for a brief break, and Malcolm stepped into the corridor to collect his thoughts. Priya joined him, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You're doing great," she said. "But they're going to push back harder." "I know," Malcolm replied. "I'm ready." Just as he spoke, Daniels appeared, his expression stormy. He approached Malcolm with deliberate steps, his voice low but sharp. "You don't know what you're getting into." Malcolm met his gaze evenly. "Enlighten me." Daniels glanced around, lowering his voice further. "You think this is just about me and a bad decision. You have no idea how deep this goes." Malcolm frowned. "Then tell me." Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting to the corridor's security cameras. "Not here." "Then where?" Malcolm pressed. Daniels leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The system isn't just broken, it's rigged. If you keep pushing, you're going to uncover things you might not want to see." The words sent a chill through Malcolm, but they also steeled his resolve. If the truth is uncomfortable, that's all the more reason to expose it. Daniels straightened, his face unreadable. "Just remember, once you cross a line, there's no going back." Malcolm watched as Daniels walked away, his cryptic warning lingering in the air. The hearing reconvened, the energy in the room more charged than before. Malcolm took his seat, his mind racing with Daniels' words. When the chairman called for final statements, Malcolm stood one last time. "I want to be clear," he said, his voice steady, despite the storm inside. "This isn't about blame, it's about responsibility. Responsibility to address the flaws in our systems, to ensure they serve everyone equally. We can't keep making excuses, we must act." The audience erupted in applause, though it was quickly stifled by the chairman's gavel. As Malcolm sat down, he felt the weight of the moment. The stakes had never been higher, and the path forward was uncertain. As the council deliberated, Malcolm stepped outside, the night air cool against his skin. The protesters were still there, their chants echoing in the distance. Priya joined him, her expression softening. "You were incredible," she said. "Thanks," Malcolm replied, though his voice was heavy. "But this is far from over." Before Priya could respond, Malcolm's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "If you want the truth, meet me tonight. 10 p.m. address below." Malcolm stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. The address was in an industrial part of town, far from the safety of the hospital or his home. "Who is it?" Priya asked. Malcolm hesitated. "A lead. It might be nothing, or it might be everything." Priya frowned. "You can't go alone." "I have to," Malcolm said, his voice resolute. "If there's a chance to uncover the truth, I can't let it slip away." As the clock ticked closer to 10 p.m., Malcolm's resolve deepened. He knew the risks, but he also knew the stakes. The truth was within reach, he just had to find it. The industrial lot was quiet, except for the hum of a distant generator. Malcolm stood under a flickering streetlight, his breath visible in the cold night air. The address from the anonymous message had led him here, to a rundown warehouse on the city's outskirts. He glanced at his phone, the time ticking past 10 p.m. for a moment. Doubt crept in. What if this was a trap? Before he could overthink, the warehouse door creaked open. Officer Daniels stepped out, his posture tense, but his expression resolute. "You came," Daniels said, his voice low. "I'm here for answers," Malcolm replied, his tone firm. "You said there's more to this. Start talking." Daniels hesitated, then gestured for Malcolm to follow inside. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on a table covered in files and flash drives. "This is everything," Daniels said, motioning to the table. "Internal memos, training manuals, incident reports. It's proof of how deep the bias runs in the department. Policies that target minorities, quotas that push officers to profile people like you." Malcolm's stomach twisted as he flipped through the documents. The evidence was damning. Emails instructing officers to prioritize stops in high-risk neighborhoods, coded language that barely disguised racial profiling, and records of complaints buried under bureaucratic red tape. "This is systemic," Malcolm said, his voice thick with anger. "How did you get this?" Daniels looked away. "I've known about it for years, most of us have, but nobody speaks up, too afraid of losing their jobs, or worse." "And now?" Malcolm pressed. "Why now?" Daniels sighed. "Because you're right, apologies aren't enough. If I'm serious about change, I have to start here." Malcolm studied the officer's face, searching for any sign of deceit. But Daniels seemed genuine, his expression weary but determined. "You're putting yourself at risk," Malcolm said. "So are you," Daniels countered. The next morning, Malcolm walked into Priya's office, the files and drives clutched in his hands. Her eyes widened as he dumped the evidence onto her desk. "What is all this?" she asked. "Everything we need to expose the truth," Malcolm said. "This isn't just about my case anymore, it's about dismantling the system that allows this to happen." Priya began sifting through the files, her shock turning to resolve. This could blow the department wide open. "Not just the department," Malcolm said. "The entire city, we need to go public." Within hours, Malcolm and Priya had assembled a team of lawyers, activists, and journalists. They pored over the evidence, corroborating details, and preparing a comprehensive exposé. By evening, a trusted investigative journalist broke the story, publishing a scathing article that named names, exposed policies, and demanded accountability. The fallout was immediate. The city was in uproar. Protests swelled to unprecedented sizes, and demands for police reform echoed across social media and news outlets. The hospital board, which had been teetering on the edge of suspending Malcolm, abruptly reversed course. They issued a public statement, not only supporting him, but pledging resources to address healthcare inequities in underserved communities. Evelyn Carter, however, was conspicuously absent from the announcement. Rumors swirled that she had been pressured to step down, her resistance to Malcolm's advocacy painting her as an obstacle to progress. As for Daniels, his confession and the leaked evidence earned him both scorn and reluctant respect. The police union immediately distanced itself from him, but the public saw him as a whistleblower, albeit one with a complicated past. Daniels publicly resigned from the force, vowing to dedicate himself to reform efforts. Malcolm stood at the hospital's rooftop garden, the city skyline glowing under a blanket of stars. Priya joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Quite a week," she said, handing him a cup. Malcolm chuckled softly. "That's one way to put it." "You did it," she said, her tone warm. "You turned everything around." "It wasn't just me," Malcolm said, his voice thoughtful. "It was everyone, the protesters, the journalists, even Daniels. It took all of us." Priya nodded. "Still, you were the catalyst, you didn't let them silence you." Malcolm stared out at the city, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and exhaustion. "It doesn't feel like enough," he admitted. "The system's still standing, the fight's not over." "No, it's not," Priya agreed. "But you've shaken its foundations. That's how change starts." In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of Malcolm's stand continued to grow. City officials announced a comprehensive review of police policies, pledging to implement reforms recommended by independent experts. The hospital board launched a diversity and inclusion initiative, with Malcolm as its lead advisor. Malcolm, however, was under no illusions. Change would be slow, met with resistance at every turn. But for the first time, he felt hope, a sense that the tide was beginning to shift. One evening, as he prepared to leave the hospital, a young black man approached him in the corridor. The man looked nervous, clutching a folder to his chest. "Dr. Grant?" he said hesitantly. "Yes?" Malcolm replied, turning to face him. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man said, his voice trembling. "I'm a med student, and seeing what you've done, it's inspiring. It makes me believe I can do this." Malcolm smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through him. "You can. And when you do, make sure you use your voice. Don't let them tell you it doesn't matter." The man nodded, his expression brightening. As he walked away, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but he wasn't alone. That night, Malcolm sat at his desk, drafting a speech for an upcoming conference on systemic reform. His phone buzzed with a message from Priya. "Dinner tomorrow, my treat." He smiled, typing back a quick reply. "Wouldn't miss it." As he leaned back in his chair, the city lights twinkling outside his window, Malcolm allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. He had found his voice, his strength, and he wasn't done using either. Malcolm sat in the quiet solitude of his home office, the glow of the city skyline casting soft patterns across the walls. The noise of the past few weeks, protests, news coverage, board meetings, had begun to fade, leaving space for reflection. He sipped a cup of tea, letting its warmth settle the lingering tension in his chest. For the first time, in what felt like months, he could finally breathe. The events that had unfolded were nothing short of transformative. What began as a single moment of injustice, a routine traffic stop turned humiliation, had grown into a movement. It had unearthed the ugly realities of systemic bias and galvanized a city to demand change. But for Malcolm, it had done something even more profound. It had reshaped his understanding of his own power and purpose. Closing the arc. Before the encounter at the diner, Malcolm had always prided himself on his resilience, his ability to navigate the subtle and overt challenges of being a black man in spaces that weren't built for him. He had learned to excel within the system, believing that his achievements could shield him from its cruelties. But that morning, under the scrutinizing gaze of Officer Daniels, all those shields had been stripped away. In that moment, Malcolm wasn't Dr. Grant, the celebrated surgeon. He was simply another black man, presumed guilty for existing. The journey that followed forced Malcolm to confront hard truths about the limits of individual success in a flawed system. But it also revealed something else. The power of community, of speaking out, and of standing firm in the face of adversity. Malcolm had always believed in change, but now he understood that change required more than silent perseverance. It required courage, disruption, and a willingness to face the fallout. Through the ordeal, Malcolm found his voice, not just as a doctor, but as an advocate for justice. It was a role he hadn't sought, but one he now embraced fully. He had faced the system and exposed its cracks. He had seen allies emerge from unexpected places and learned that even those complicit in the system, like Daniels, were capable of redemption. Broader implications. Malcolm's personal battle had shone a light on deeper systemic issues that extended far beyond his own experience. The files Daniels had provided painted a chilling picture of institutionalized bias, revealing how policies and practices perpetuated cycles of harm. These weren't just the actions of a few bad actors. They were the result of a system designed to target, marginalize, and control. The public response to the revelations was overwhelming. Protests swept the city, demanding accountability and reform. The local government pledged to overhaul policing policies, while the hospital, under new leadership, committed to addressing racial disparities in healthcare access and treatment. These changes were incremental and imperfect, but they were a start. A sign that the tide was shifting. Malcolm often thought about the young man who had approached him at the hospital, the med student who found inspiration in his stand. That moment stayed with him, a reminder that the fight wasn't just about dismantling systems, it was about paving the way for those who came after. Change wasn't linear or immediate, but it was possible, and it began with actions like his. Inspiration for the audience. To those watching from the outside, Malcolm's journey was a testament to the power of resilience and the necessity of collective action. It showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one voice could spark a movement. It also revealed the complexities of progress, the personal sacrifices it demanded, the discomfort it caused, and the courage it required. The story of Malcolm's stand resonated far and wide, sparking conversations in households, classrooms, and boardrooms. People who had once ignored or dismissed the realities of systemic bias were now forced to confront them. And while not everyone was moved to action, enough were to make a difference. Malcolm's experience underscored an essential truth. Progress isn't just about tearing down what's broken, it's about building something better in its place. That work is ongoing, requiring vigilance, compassion, and the willingness to listen and learn. Emotional closure. One evening, Malcolm found himself walking through the city park, where a group of community members had gathered for a candlelight vigil. They were there to honor victims of systemic injustice and to celebrate the progress made in their fight for equity. As Malcolm approached, several people turned to him, their faces lighting up with recognition. "You gave us hope," an older woman said, pressing his hands in hers. "Thank you," a young man added, "for standing up, even when it wasn't easy." Malcolm nodded, his throat tight with emotion. These weren't just words of gratitude. They were affirmations of something bigger. His actions had mattered, not just for himself, but for so many others. As the candles flickered in the evening breeze, Malcolm felt a profound sense of closure. The struggle wasn't over, but he had made an impact. He had stood against the tide and shown others that it was possible to push back. A glimpse of the future. The next morning, Malcolm sat at his desk, drafting the opening lines of his speech for an upcoming national conference on systemic reform. His phone buzzed with a message from Priya. "Lunch tomorrow, we have a lot to plan for." Malcolm smiled, thinking of the road ahead. There was still so much work to be done, reforms to advocate for, systems to challenge, and minds to change. But he was ready for it. He was no longer just a surgeon or an advocate. He was a symbol of what could be achieved when one refused to stay silent. As he hit save on his draft, Malcolm glanced at a small plaque on his desk, a gift from his surgical team. It read, "For the ones who fight for others, even when it's hardest." Malcolm leaned back, the words a quiet reminder of his journey. The fight wasn't over, but neither was his resolve. He had found his light in the darkness, and now, he was determined to share it.